In this video, we'll be designing a brand for Brewland, a cafe based in Atlantis, aka it's made up. Branding for places like this can often be super generic, like we get it, you serve coffee. And I want to show you how we can create something that's original but still connects to what the business does. Because that, my friends, is how we can create brands that businesses will happily shell out the moolah for.
Show me the money.
But the question is, how do we create something that's original? Well, there's a 4-step framework we need to go through, and the first step requires us to become a detective. Before we can begin creating Brewland's visual identity and creating something distinct from other brands in the industry, we need to put on our detective hat and ask the client some crucial questions. So, how did Brewland come to life? Give me the backstory. I've got some notes on this. So, as someone who's always been a big dreamer and lover of fairy tales, I've always wanted to create a place that seamlessly combines fantasy with everyday life. And what better way to do that than opening a coffee shop, right? So what goals do you have for your business? So I kind of want to create this immersive experience for customers where people can escape from reality for a while. That's really cool. So what would you say makes Brewland different from other cafes? So coffee shops are commonly associated with that morning rush, but at Brewland, we provide an escape where you can relax and forget about everyday life. This transforms the cafe into more than just a place, resulting in customers spending more time at our cafe than they would elsewhere. That sounds so cool. So what kind of personality does Brewland have? I'd probably say creative, adventurous, playful, imaginative, and pretty enchanting. So who are you trying to attract? It's probably fellow dreamers, but I'd say young adults, maybe anyone who desires more than just a routine coffee break. So, after interrogating the client, we've extracted valuable information that's given us a really clear understanding of the business and the desired direction. If you're unsure about what questions to ask your clients, you can download this resource from my website that will help you. I'll leave a link to it in the description. But now it's time to put down the magnifying glass and cover up, because in step 2, we need to go behind enemy lines. During this step, we need to gather information on Brewland's competitors and the wider industry to identify Brewland's competitive advantage. To accomplish this, we will identify Brewland's top 3 competitors and analyze their brand foundations, visual identity, as well as note down any strengths and weaknesses we come across. So now we have all this information on the competitors, we can start to see how Brewland can differentiate themselves. So for example, there's an overuse of using browns and greens. Now while some colours are really great to use because they're recognisable to the industry, doing something a little different will be a really great way for them to stand out. Now, there's also a common trend of brands using the theme of their cafe within their branding, like Celestial Beans, a space-themed cafe using cosmic colours and a space-themed logo. Now, this works well as it tells the viewer exactly what they're going to experience, making it instantly recognisable and allowing each competitor to stand out on their own. With a competitive advantage now identified, we can now put together a mood board that will act as a guide when designing the brand's visual identity. To create this, we need to gather a collection of visuals that showcase the desired direction of the brand. It's important that these visuals convey a consistent creative direction and align with the brand's goals, story, and target audience, details we've uncovered through becoming a detective. So here's the final mood board, and it focuses on 3 key areas. First, the rough colour palette. We want to make sure we're creating that enchanting feeling, so we've stuck to the greens commonly used in the industry. We've also added a dash of purple to help symbolise potions and magic. Then secondly, typography style. So when looking for inspiration, there was a common trend of fairy tale books using whimsical fonts with loads of flicks and flourishes, which would work really nicely alongside their brand story. And then thirdly, illustration style, again taken from the fairy tale book front covers. Now these illustrations and patterns create a really nice sense of wonder and also draw your eye into the center, which I really liked. Now putting these mood boards together now means that we have a visual guide to follow when designing the brand, backed by strategy. Now that we have a strategically backed guide to follow, the design process becomes much easier. Instead of staring at a blank screen, we already have a clear direction, and this direction leads straight to step number 3 in this 4-part framework, which is entering the lab. But what's a lab without subjects to experiment on? So before proceeding, I need to find some typefaces that match the direction of the mood board. Then I can narrow these choices down to the strongest contenders, which will serve as the foundation for our experiments. So I'm in the lab, aka Adobe Illustrator, and here are the two strongest typefaces. So the first has a medieval feel to it, fitting in nicely with the creative direction. I also like how the thorns on the side of the letters add character. And then the other typeface feels quite fairy tale-like with its swashes and flicks. It's a bit wild at the moment, but I can see potential with some adjustments. So I'm going to customize the first typeface, and something I want to try and do is adjust the letters to make them more free-flowing and less stiff. So I'm going to start on the R first because this has a really nice bold to it, a nice curve which we can add a flick into. So I'm going to grab the eraser tool, I'm just going to remove this part here, grab the pencil tool, and then I can start adjusting this part here, adding a really nice flick into it, into that center bowl so it curves around really nicely. And I'm just going to grab the direct selection tool, move this part up, and then I'm going to just round off this corner slightly so it is a little bit less harsh. So that little tweak has made it feel a lot less stiff and has brought in a really nice whimsical touch to it. So what I think I'm going to do now is follow the same consistency on this D because it follows that same curve, has that really nice bold to it, which is going to make it easy to replicate. So I'm just going to bring this R across, and then the aim is to just get that top flick. So I'm going to use the direct selection tool to move that down. We'll grab the eraser tool, and I'm just going to get rid of parts of the letter so I can then put this on top of the D, and then I can cut away at that original D. So I'm just using the eraser tool to do that. We'll need to tidy this up a bit, but as you can see, we're following the same consistency. We've got the exact same flick on those two letters. So after continuing to experiment with this typeface, here's what I've managed to come up with so far. Now, as you can see, something feels just a little bit off. I feel like there's this Halloween feel to it that I was concerned that would happen. It kind of reminds me of the characters from the film The Nightmare Before Christmas. The logo type needs to have a sense of playfulness and intertwining, like the letters are coming together to narrate a story rather than being rigid and formal. So I'm going to leave this for now and move on to customizing the other typeface. So the first place I'm going to start is removing the swash from this R so that there's less of a gap between the B and the R. So to do this, I'm going to grab the eraser tool, and I'm just going to slice off this part of the swash. And we will remove that part, and then we will grab the direct selection tool. I'm just going to bring this anchor point down slightly, and then we'll adjust the curve. And that's already starting to look better already, and it means we can now bring the R closer to the B so there's less of that gap. So next, the E and the W are too far apart because of that swash. So I'm actually going to intertwine these two together because that top of that W forms really nicely into that E. So we'll just line this up. I'm going to grab the pencil tool, and I'm just adjusting this W on its original path so that it flows really nicely into that E. And then we just tidy this bit up, and then I'm going to do the same to the E, where I'm just using the pencil tool to kind of cut away that top flick. And then I'm going to select both of these, grab the Pathfinder Press Unite so that the two unite together, and then I'm just going to press the Option tool and just toggle the Smooth tool so that these flow nicely into one another. So moving on to some more letters. Now the L and the A are practically touching, so I'm going to adjust this here. I think it might work if this part of the A kind of forms over this swash of the L. So what I'm going to do is actually just drag this part down so it sits nicely on the baseline. And then I think maybe we need to actually remove that swash because it's too much with the other swash. So I'm going to just grab the eraser tool. I'm just going to, this is probably going to be a little bit messy, but we can always tidy stuff up. So I'm just removing this. I'm actually going to remove this bottom part here. And then we'll grab the pencil tool, and I'm just going to get rid of that part there. And then we could add a swash in here so that it kind of forms nicely over that top part of the L. So I've tidied this up, and the last thing I want to do is adjust these sharp edged swashes into more rounded corners to create drip-like features to fit in with drinking coffee. So you may have noticed that I've been designing in all caps. Now this is because it aligns with the trend seen in fairy tale book covers, which links back to the strategy. Anyway, here's a before and after of the typeface. As you've seen, I've mainly been using the pencil tool for customization, which is why I put together a complete course dedicated to this powerful tool. So if you're interested in becoming a pencil tool pro, I'll leave a link to it in the description. Now that our first experiment has been successful and we've finalized the logo type, we need to create a variation that can be used in a small space. Because when we shrink down the logo type, it becomes difficult to read. Therefore, my next experiment is to design a brand mark. However, this is where I see many cafes and coffee shops make a big mistake. Take a look at these logos as an example. What issues do you see? They lack distinctiveness, they blend into one another, and they're too literal. As a brand designer, you need to avoid using cliche elements in your logos. In this case, the cliche element to be avoided is the coffee cup. Why? Because everyone's already thought of it, and it's become the go-to for countless brands. Here's something to remember. If it's your initial idea, chances are it's everyone else's too. If you want to make your client's brand stand out, you need to start thinking outside of the box. Revisiting the brand story and foundations can be a great way to spark some new ideas. So after I did this for Brewland, something that really stood out to me was the word dive. Now this was from their brand's mission, which was to help people escape the usual routine and dive into a world of enchantment. This word sparked an idea in my mind. I thought about playing on the name Brewland and creating something that would represent it as a mythical place. After brainstorming some ideas, I decided that a castle would be a suitable symbol as it often appears in fairy tales.
That must be Lord Farquaad's castle.
That's the place.
Do you think maybe he's compensating for something?
Now my next step was to try and find a way to merge the brand's unique story with this concept. So I started with the castle inside the coffee cup, but I didn't like the idea of it being a full cup as it's a bit cliche and it kind of looked more like a soup bowl. So I scrapped that and then I used the top of the cup as the hull, allowing the castle to pop out, giving it a really nice sense of movement, kind of acting like it's a portal to a new world, creating that enchanting feeling. And then as you can see, I've tested the idea of drips coming out of the hole, but it didn't quite work. So then this idea turned into adding water around the castle to represent coffee, as well as adding stars and bubbles to link back to their tagline, magic in every sip. Once I was happy with the brand mark, I incorporated it into the original logo type to ensure the logo suite was consistent and recognizable. So now we have three variations. The primary, which consists of the logo type on one line and the brand mark above, a stacked variation with the brand mark in the middle and logo type surrounding it, and then the brand mark on its own. Now this just means if the logo needs to be used in wider, longer, or smaller spaces, there's a variation to ensure its responsiveness. Now the logo suite has been finalized, it's time to move on to creating some brand assets, and in this case, illustrations. So for this, I'm going to take inspiration from the mood board as well as whimsical illustrations commonly found on the front covers of fairy tale books. Now many of these books features illustrations surrounding the edges, with the main focus being the text on the inside, and I like how this draws your eyes in. So to create these illustrations, I'm going to use the pencil tool to draw some mystical elements like leaves, flowers, stars, mushrooms, etc. to link back to enchantment and magic. So my starting point is going to be drawing a flower. So I'm just going to draw the stem and then add the flower head. Now there's a handy tip here, so if you double click the pencil tool icon, it will bring up the settings. Now I like to have this option ticked, which means I can press option when using the pencil tool and it will quickly switch to the smooth tool. Now this way, when you draw a line, you can smooth it out if it's a little too rigid. So I'm just gonna make this a little bit longer and then we'll move on to the next illustration. So I'm gonna just draw a really simple star. Now it doesn't have to be perfect at this point because I'm just trying to figure out the layout of all of these illustrations together. So next, I think it would be cool to add a coffee reference in here, but we'll keep it small so it's not the focal point. So I'm just gonna draw the top of it. Actually, we'll make it a little bit more pointed. And then we'll draw a semicircle. Just pressing option for the smooth toggle, and then we'll draw the little handle on the side, bring this down slightly, and then we'll add some little rays coming out of it just to highlight the coffee. So one thing we need to make sure is that the illustrations maintain a similar style to the brand mark. So what I'm going to do is add in some similar bubbles and stars to keep things nice and consistent. So I'm just going to continue drawing some more illustrations, adding some more flowers and leaves, and then I'll check in with you after. Okay, so here's what I've put together, and I'm so happy with how it's actually turned out because it's what I'd envisioned, which can sometimes be really hard to nail. So I had this idea of the illustrations forming around the logo, like on the fairy tale books, so let's bring that to life. So I'm gonna mirror this by duplicating it, right-clicking, transform, and then reflect, and then I'm just gonna remove any necessary bits that overlap. Now the good thing about this is I can use these illustrations separately within the brand and not just as a pattern, which is going to be really handy for things like packaging and stationery. With the logo suite and illustrations done, it's time to move on to step 4 and start thinking like Tom. This is Tom, in case anyone's wondering. See, he thinks differently, and we need to adopt this mindset as we enter the final stage of the brand design process. In this stage, we'll be putting together a color palette for this brand. This is another opportunity to set Bruland's visual identity apart from the generic coffee shop branding. So to start this process, I'm going to use the colors that were included in the mood board, and then from there, I'm just going to start testing out different tones and shades. Now, whilst I do this, I want to explain why I only add color once all the visual elements of the brand have been designed. So I do this because it allows me to focus on the legibility of the designs, which can sometimes become blurred if you add color too early in the process. Now, with that said, I'm just going to continue experimenting with different colors, and I'll check in with you once I've landed on something. So after some time experimenting, I've narrowed down my choices to 2 favorites. I've tested both of these color palettes with the brand's visual assets to ensure compatibility, and now I need to choose one. Now, the more I look at them both, I think the first color palette is the strongest. And I'm drawn more to the turquoise color as it evokes that sense of magic and enchantment, while the brown color links back to the coffee. However, I do think that this palette could be simplified by removing some of the green hues. So we'll keep these 2 and then maintain the lighter and darker colors to ensure it's balanced. With that finalized, I'm now going to put the visual identity together into a brand presentation so we can see what the finished product looks like. So one important thing to try and remember when presenting your work is that it's crucial to shift the focus away from your personal branding and instead highlight the direction of the brand. It's kind of helpful to think of this whole presentation as a mock-up that helps the client understand their new visual direction. So within this presentation, I showcase the logo suite and its variations with annotations explaining design decisions and the thought process, a crucial thing when presenting your work. Then the following section introduces the brand's fonts, listing the primary, secondary, and complementary choices with explanations for their selection and them in action. Then another page details the brand's color palette, explaining the meaning behind these choices and how they align with the strategy. Then a look at their brand assets and their illustrations and their connection to the brand story. And then lastly, there are pages filled with mock-ups displaying the branding action, which really help bring it to life. With the visual identity now finalized, there's one more step required in order to design original brands that avoid the pitfall of being generic. If you want to find out what this last step is, watch this video here where I reveal the secret to designing like a pro.